At 70 years old, when most people are told to slow down, he started over, not by chance, not by accident, but by decision. They told him he was too old, that it was too late, that dreams like this had an expiration date, but they were wrong. And now, you're about to hear the truth they never believed. This is not just a story about medicine. It's a story about time, about memory, and the hidden fire we bury deep inside when life convinces us to settle. This is the story of James Elwood, the man who became a doctor when the world expected him to disappear. It started on a cold winter morning. The window of his apartment was frosted. The kettle hissed on the stove. James sat alone at his small table, staring at an envelope he hadn't opened in over a week. His fingers traced the edge of it. He knew what it was. He just wasn't ready to face what it meant. Inside that envelope was a letter from the university, a response to something he never thought he'd do. He had applied to medical school. At the age of 70, James Elwood had lived a life of structure. He was a systems man. Numbers, reports, discipline. For 40 years, he worked at a multinational bank. Compliance, order, control. Gray suits, black briefcase, reputation, reliable but forgettable. He wasn't flashy, not ambitious, but loyal. To his job, to the rules, to expectations. Like many people, he had silenced his dreams. So long ago, he almost forgot they existed. Almost. There was one memory he could never forget. He was 12 years old, sitting beside his mother's hospital bed. She had been sick for months. He didn't understand most of what was said, but he remembered how it felt. White coats, calm voices, that quiet strength in the room. One nurse kneeled beside him, smiled and said, "Don't worry, we're taking care of her." That sentence changed him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. In that moment, James knew he wanted to be that voice, the one who brings peace. But life had other plans. He was the first in his family to finish high school. University was a stretch. Medical school, impossible. His father worked in a warehouse. His mother died the next year. They had no money and no time for dreams. He applied to business school. It was affordable. It made sense. And with that, he buried the dream deep. He retired at 66. The same week he buried his wife, Margaret. They were married 42 years. Her absence was louder than silence. He tried gardening, volunteering, walking clubs, but the fog never lifted. Until one day, walking past the hospital near his building, he stopped. He stood still, watched people in scrubs pass through the doors. And suddenly, the thought returned. I still want this. He didn't tell anyone. He just began. He searched online, prerequisites, exams, application forms. He ordered textbooks and started studying again. Physics, biology, chemistry, subjects he hadn't touched in 50 years. His neighbor Evelyn saw him one morning. He was reading biochemistry in the laundry room. She laughed. "What are you doing with that?" James smiled, catching up. People thought it was sweet, a distraction, a hobby. But for James, it wasn't about passing time. It was about not wasting what was left of it. Now, back to the envelope. That cold morning, he finally opened it. Dear M.R. Elwood, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted. His hands trembled. He read it again and again. Then he cried, not from fear, not from doubt, but because he knew this was it, a new beginning. At an age when most people are told they're done, it meant proving something, not to the world, but to himself, that he was still becoming. Can you imagine that? Waking up at 70 and deciding to become a doctor? And yet, That was only the beginning. James hadn't been inside a classroom in nearly 50 years. But now, here he was wearing a backpack, holding a schedule, and standing in a sea of students, most of whom were younger than his grandchildren. Orientation day. It felt surreal. The halls smelled like coffee and paper. Posters hung on every wall. Clubs, seminars, events. Everyone moved with energy, with youth, with time. James stood still. He smiled politely when someone bumped into him. But inside, he was shaking. His steps were slow. Not because of his age, but because of doubt. What am I doing here? Am I out of place? Will I survive this? He found his seat in the lecture hall. Row 3, far left. Next to a girl with blue hair and headphones. She looked at him, raised one eyebrow, then went back to her phone. James exhaled. This wasn't going to be easy. Not academically, and definitely not socially. The first few weeks felt like swimming upstream. He couldn't remember chemical equations. The symbols blurred together. The pace was relentless. He spent his evenings reviewing basic biology, then re-reviewing it again, then again. What took others 1 hour took him 3. His memory wasn't what it once was, and the tools had changed. Digital flashcards, video lectures, online labs. He didn't even own a smartphone. Once, he asked a question in class, a simple one. The room went silent. A boy in the back chuckled. Another whispered, "Why is he even here?" James heard it. He felt it, but he said nothing. He sat straighter and kept listening. At home, the days were long. His apartment was quiet, too quiet. The books were always open. The TV stayed off. And at night, doubt came like a whisper. "You're too late. You should have done this when you were younger. You'll never catch up." He wrote those sentences down on a notepad, then crossed each one out, one by one. But some nights were harder than others. One evening after a long anatomy lecture, he stared at his notes, pages of terms, muscles, nerves, Latin names. It felt like trying to read a language from another planet. His eyes burned. His hands ached. His spirit cracked. He looked up to the empty chair where Margaret once sat. He imagined her voice. "Jimmy, don't quit." Not this time. He closed his notebook, not in defeat, but to breathe. He knew he'd open it again tomorrow. He always did. Weeks passed, then months. He wasn't the fastest, but he was the most consistent. He arrived early, sat in the same seat, took notes by hand, asked questions, and slowly, something shifted. A few students began nodding when he spoke. A girl in his lab group asked him to explain a concept. He did, clearly, calmly. She smiled. "Thanks, James. That actually makes sense now." That moment stayed with him. It was small, but it was something. Every day, James walked the same route to campus, through the park, past the bakery, across the main street. The world outside moved fast, but James moved with intention. One morning, it rained. He slipped on a puddle, fell hard, hit his hip. He sat there, soaked, embarrassed, alone. A young man ran over, helped him up, held his bag. "Sir, are you okay?" James winced. "I'll be fine." The student noticed the medical textbook in his hand. "Are you a doctor?" James smiled. "Not yet." The boy nodded, impressed, then walked him to the campus gate. That moment mattered. It reminded James of something powerful. Even in weakness, he could still inspire. By the end of the first semester, James passed all his classes, not with top grades, but with pride, with dignity, with resilience. He walked out of his last exam and looked up at the sky. He whispered, One down, many to go. His eyes teared. But not from stress, from something deeper. Healing. But then came winter. And with it, illness. James caught a flu. Nothing major, but enough to keep him home for a week. He fell behind. Assignments piled up. Deadlines approached. The old voice returned. You can't afford setbacks. You're running out of time. And for the first time, he considered quitting. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he opened the letter. The textbook closed. The room dim. His hand hovered over the keyboard. Email draft withdrawal request. Subject line ready. Just one click away. Then, a knock at the door. It was Evelyn, the neighbor from upstairs. She brought soup and a small note. It read, "You inspired me to go back to painting. I thought I was too old, but you proved otherwise." Thank you, James. He stared at it for a long time. The email stayed unsent. The second year began with less fear, but with more weight. James was no longer the strange student in the room. He was respected. Some classmates called him professor as a joke. Others came to him for advice. But deep down, he still carried a silent doubt. Because starting is one thing, continuing is something else entirely. The subjects grew harder: pharmacology, microbiology, clinical diagnostics. The tests were more demanding, the hours more intense, and his body started to feel it. James began waking up with pain in his back. His legs ached after long hours in the lecture halls. His eyes struggled to read the small text on the slides. He needed new glasses and more time. By that stage, most students were speeding up, but James needed to go deeper. While others memorized, he had to understand. Every concept was a battle, every lecture a mountain. Still, he showed up, patient, present, and more than anything, purposeful. Margaret still visited his thoughts, especially in the silent nights. Sometimes he spoke out loud to the empty chair by the kitchen table. You would have loved today's class. Remember how much you hated needles. I'm still going, love, still moving forward. During a physical exam class, James had to practice on a fellow student. Check heart rate, blood pressure, pupil response. The student's name was Lucas, 22 years old. James asked for permission, placed the stethoscope gently, listened to the heartbeat. Thump, 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 strong, steady, young. For a moment, James felt something stir inside. How can something so simple be so beautiful? That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Life is measured in heartbeats. Each sound is a chance, and I'm listening to all of them." But not every day was like that. Some mornings came with fog in his brain. He forgot formulas. He missed schedules. One day, he walked into the wrong classroom, sat down without realizing. The class started laughing. A kind professor tapped him on the shoulder. James stood up, smiled softly, but inside, he broke a little. Am I aging faster in here? The following week, during a practical exam, James froze. He stood in front of a tray of tools. He knew what to do, but his hands didn't move. The professor waited, then quietly marked him with a fail. It was James' first red mark in nearly 2 years. He went home silently, closed the door, sat down, and stayed there for hours. No books, no lights, just silence. He remembered the bank, how everything used to be predictable. Monday to Friday, same chair, same routine. He never failed there. But now, he was trying to be who he really was, and failing hurt more. That night, he looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were deeper, his wrinkles more defined, but behind them, still, a spark. The next day, he asked the professor for a second chance. The professor hesitated, then smiled. If it were another student, maybe not. But you deserve it, James. He redid the exam, calmly, with focus. This time, he passed, with a compliment. James walked out of the room with a quiet heart. He didn't smile. He just breathed. Every small victory was a return to the man he always was, but had never been allowed to be. Over time, James gained all eyes. One professor invited him to tutor younger students. He helped them with anatomy. He used simple comparisons. He explained patiently. And there, magic happened. "Professor Elwood, you should really teach," one student said. He smiled, but inside, he wanted more. He wanted to practice, to feel the pulse, to see the patient's eyes. He didn't want just theory. He wanted life. By the end of his second year, it was time for clinical rotations. James was assigned to a public hospital, first as an observer, then, slowly, as an assistant. He wore the white coat, his name badge, and walked through the doors. The hospital was nothing like the classroom. There was no time to hesitate. People needed answers. And James listened, watched, learned, not from books, but from people. One day, an elderly woman came in. Chest pain. The staff moved quickly. EKG, medication, vitals. James stood beside her, held her hand. She trembled. He leaned in and said, "You're safe now. We're here with you." She looked into his eyes. Something shifted. Her body relaxed. Her breathing slowed. She believed him. That night, walking out of the hospital, James stopped under a street lamp, looked up, let the night wind touch his face. He smiled, not because of a diagnosis, not because of a perfect answer, but because for the first time, he didn't feel like a student. He felt like a healer. Have you ever felt that? That quiet moment when, after so much struggle, you realize you already are what you've been searching for. That the paper doesn't define it. The system doesn't define it. Your soul does. James walked home in silence, but inside, life was roaring. He knew there was still a long road ahead, still more to study, still more to prove. But now, he wasn't chasing an identity. He was living it. It was a Tuesday morning, nothing extraordinary. No sign from the sky, no dramatic thunder. Just James, standing in front of his mirror, white coat on, eyes fixed on the man he had become. He had just completed his third clinical rotation. Cardiology. Hard days, harder nights. He had witnessed life begin again and end, sometimes in the same shift. But this morning felt different. It wasn't about becoming anymore. It was about being. He took the elevator down to the street. The city was waking up. Buses honked. People rushed. Coffee steam filled the air. James walked slowly. He wasn't in a hurry. Not anymore. He arrived at the hospital gate, showed his badge, walked through. This time, no nerves, no racing thoughts, just purpose. His assignment for the day: emergency room, triage team, the kind of place where decisions are fast and mistakes are never quiet. Within 10 minutes, the first case arrived. Young woman, car accident, blood pressure dropping. The lead resident shouted instructions. James followed. Gloves, 4. Compression. He worked without panic, without doubt, as if he had always belonged there. Later that day, a boy was brought in. 6 years old, high fever, seizures. The mother was crying, screaming. James kneeled next to her, held her arm, and gently said, "You're not alone. We're doing everything we can." She looked at him, tears still falling, but quieter now. And in that moment, James remembered his 12-year-old self, sitting beside his mother's hospital bed, hearing those same words. We're taking care of her. He wasn't repeating a line. He was reliving it, fulfilling it. Full circle. That evening, the chief of emergency approached him. Elwood, you handled that chaos well. How long have you been here? James smiled. Almost 3 years. The chief raised an eyebrow. You've got something, you know that? James didn't answer, just nodded, because inside, he already knew. It wasn't skill alone. It was presence, a kind of medicine they don't teach in school. After the shift, he sat alone in the locker room, removed his coat, folded it slowly. He looked at the name tag again, J. Elwood Med Student, and whispered not for long. The next day, he received a letter. Final exam schedule, graduation details, white coat ceremony. He smiled, not because it meant the end, but because it meant the beginning had finally arrived. The next few weeks were intense. Final tests, presentations, sleepless nights. But James was steady, grounded, because this time, he wasn't afraid to be tested. He was ready to prove what life had already shown him. His classmates were buzzing about residencies, cities, specialties, salaries. James stayed quiet. His dream wasn't prestige. It was presence. He applied for residency at that same hospital, where he had listened, served, healed. The one where he had found himself. Weeks passed. He waited. Didn't stress. Didn't panic. Then one morning, another envelope. He opened it. Read slowly. We are pleased to offer you a position. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, felt everything. And then, silence. But not the silence of doubt. The silence of peace. James walked out that day, not with pride, but with wholeness. He walked to the park, sat on the bench, watched people pass. Young, old, lost, in love, alone, and thought everyone is becoming something, even when they think it's over. At that moment, a child ran past him, stumbled, fell. James stood up, helped him up. The boy looked at him and smiled. Thanks, mister. James smiled back. Anytime. He sat down again, looked at the sunset, and in the glow of fading light, he whispered, I made it. I finally made it. Have you ever felt that? The quiet joy of finishing something that no one believed you could even start? That moment when the world goes quiet, because your soul is finally loud enough to lead. This wasn't just a restart. It was a resurrection, a return to the version of himself that had waited 60 years to be heard. James Elwood didn't just become a doctor. He became whole, and that changed everything. The hospital corridors were quieter that day, not empty, just slower. James walked through them with calm steps, a rhythm that matched his breath and his purpose. It had been 2 months since the residency began. 2 months wearing that white coat, not as a student, but as a doctor. 2 months learning from patients instead of professors. His hands were steady now, his eyes sharper, his presence undeniable. But one thing hadn't changed. He still listened more than he spoke. That morning, he was assigned to a small room at the far end of the ward. Room 307, the kind of room no one rushed to, where long-term patients waited in silence, where time moved differently. Inside was a man named Harold, 83 years old, a retired music teacher, stage 4 lung cancer, no family listed, no visitors expected. James entered quietly. Harold was sitting upright, looking out the window. The sunlight touched his face, but not his eyes. He didn't turn, didn't smile. Good morning, mister. Harold, James said. A pause, no answer. He continued on, Doctor Elwood, I'll be checking in on you today. Still silence. Then finally, a voice dry and distant. Another young one? James smiled softly. Not quite. Harold turned, looked at him. Long pause. Then, you're old. James chuckled. Yes, I am. Harold stared a moment longer, then said, Good. I'm tired of being the only one. That was the start. Each day, James visited room 307. Some days, they spoke of music, others of silence. Sometimes, they said nothing at all. And that was enough. Harold began to share pieces of his life. He once conducted choirs, played piano every morning, lost his wife 30 years ago. No children. His students were his legacy. But most had moved on, or forgotten. I used to matter, he said one afternoon. I'm not sure I do anymore. James looked at him and replied, You still do. You matter right now. Harold didn't answer, but his eyes watered. He looked out the window again. That day, he asked for music. James brought a small speaker the next morning. He played Chopin, then Debussy, then a recording of a choir. Harold closed his eyes, hands trembling, whispers forming. He was conducting again, even if only in memory, and James watched as something awakened. That week, Harold's condition declined. Breathing became harder, speech softer. The nurses prepared the file, the charts, the protocols. But James, he prepared something else. He brought in a keyboard, small, old, borrowed from a nearby community center, placed it near the window, right where the light still touched the sheets. Just one more song, James said. Harold stared at it a long time, then nodded, weakly. His fingers were slow, but they remembered. He played 3 notes, then 4, broken chords, but full of soul. And for that moment, room 307 became a concert hall. A nurse entered, stopped, listened, tears formed. She didn't know why, but she knew it mattered. The next morning, Harold was gone, peacefully, quietly, on his table, a note, written in slow, shaky handwriting. It read to the doctor who saw more than my illness. Thank you for remembering my music. James folded the note, held it in his chest, stood still. That day, he didn't speak, because some days, words are too small, and silence carries everything. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, opened his notebook, the same one he had used since day one. He wrote, Purpose doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers through the dying breath of a stranger who became your teacher. He closed the notebook, closed his eyes, and whispered, Thank you. Harold, have you ever met someone for just a moment, but they left an imprint on your soul? Someone who reminded you why you started, who you are. Sometimes we chase purpose, but sometimes purpose finds us back. And in that quiet hospital room, with music in the air and no audience to applaud, a life ended. A legacy continued, and a doctor remembered why he chose this path. Not for the title, not for the science, but for the souls. It was a rainy Wednesday. Gray clouds hung low over the city, the kind of sky that made everything feel slower, softer. James walked into the hospital early, coffee in hand, heart calm. He had no idea what was waiting for him. When he reached the staff lounge, there was an envelope on the table. No markings, no address, just his name, handwritten, in black ink, Dr. James Elwood. He stared at it, then picked it up. The paper was thick, the kind used for something important or intimate. He opened it slowly, expecting perhaps an evaluation, a formal note. But what he read was something else, something that would change him forever. You don't know me, but you saved my daughter's life, and mine. James froze. He kept reading. 3 weeks ago, you held my hand in the ER. You said, You're not alone. I didn't believe you then. I was drowning in fear. But you stayed. You looked at me like I mattered. No doctor had ever done that. James sat down. The lounge was quiet, the storm outside, silent behind the glass. He kept reading. I want you to know what happened next. My daughter recovered, slowly but surely. And I remembered something. I remembered that I am a mother, not just a problem on a chart. His chest tightened. He could see her face. The panic, the tears, but not her name. He hadn't known her story, only her fear. You don't just treat people, Doctor. Elwood, you awaken them. Thank you for seeing me. For being more than a doctor, you helped me come back to myself. There was no signature, no contact, just those words. And they were enough. James folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, closed his eyes. He thought of every moment that almost made him give up. Every night he questioned if it was too late. Every step that led to this one. One patient, one sentence, one truth. That's all it takes to remember why you started. That day, James moved differently. He walked through the corridors with a deeper presence, a softer edge, not because he had changed, but because he had remembered. He spent the afternoon in the pediatric wing. Laughter filled the air, but so did fear. He sat with a boy going through chemo, 8 years old, bald, brave, bored. James brought a deck of cards. Want to play? The boy grinned. Later, he checked on an elderly woman post-surgery. She was angry, scared, tired. Why do you people always act like this is normal? She snapped. James didn't answer. He sat beside her and said softly, "It's not normal. It's just life, and I'm here with you through it." The woman didn't speak, but her breathing slowed, just enough. Sometimes healing begins where defenses end. That night, James went home. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened. He lit a candle, sat by the window, and opened his notebook again. He wrote, "We wait for big moments, graduations, titles, awards. But maybe the real victories are anonymous, unsigned, unseen by the world, but unforgettable to the soul." He stared at the flame. It flickered, danced, and he whispered, "Thank you, whoever you are." Have you ever felt it? That invisible moment when something clicks not in your mind, but in your heart? When you realize you are exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you had to break to get there? For James Elwood, this wasn't just a good day. It was the day he understood what kind of doctor he had become. He wasn't the fastest, or the most technical, or the most decorated, but he was the one they remembered, because he saw people not as problems, but as stories. And sometimes, those stories write back. It began with silence, not the comforting kind, but the kind that creeps in when something important is missing. James had been feeling it for weeks, not in his hands, not in his work, but in his soul. He still showed up, still smiled, still listened, but something had shifted. A quiet fatigue? The kind no sleep could fix. One night, after a long shift, he sat alone in the staff lounge. Lights dimmed, clock ticking, and for the first time in years, he asked himself, "Do I still belong here?" It wasn't about failure. It wasn't about age. It was about weight. The weight of stories, of loss, of healing, and of being the one everyone turned to when things went wrong. James opened his locker. Inside, a photograph. Faded, edges worn. It was his mother, smiling, holding his hand, the last picture before she died. He looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "I don't know if I can keep carrying this." The next morning, he called in sick. First time in 5 years. No one questioned him. No one pushed. He walked through the city. No destination, just movement, trying to outrun a question he wasn't ready to answer. He ended up by the lake, the same bench he sat on the day he got his acceptance letter, back when everything felt possible. Before the wait, a little girl was feeding birds nearby. She laughed, carefree. James watched her, and for a moment, he envied that lightness. Then her mother called out Maya, "Don't go too close to the water." The girl turned, tripped, and fell near the edge. James jumped, grabbed her, pulled her back before she slipped. The mother ran over, tears in her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you so much." James nodded, still catching his breath. "She's okay. She's safe." The woman looked at him and said, "Are you a doctor?" James hesitated, then replied, "Yes, I am." It hit him like a wave. He didn't say it out of pride or habit. He said it because it was true. Even outside the hospital, even on a bench by the lake, he was still a healer. That night, he returned home, opened the notebook he hadn't touched in days, and wrote, "Purpose doesn't always shine. Sometimes it flickers, but even a flicker can light the way back." The next day, he met with Dr. Green, his mentor, a quiet, steady man, older, wiser, the kind who didn't speak much but saw everything. James sat across from him and said, "I think I'm burning out." Green nodded, didn't interrupt. James continued, "I love what I do, but lately, I don't feel it, not like before." Green leaned back, then said softly, "You're not burned out, James. You're saturated." James blinked. "What do you mean?" "Burnout is when you feel nothing. Saturation is when you feel everything. Too many stories, too much grief, too much responsibility. Your heart's full, but not broken." James felt tears rise, not from pain, but from relief. He had a name for it now. Green smiled gently. "Take time, but don't walk away. The world needs doctors like you, the ones who feel too much." James nodded. For the first time in weeks, he felt understood. That weekend, he took 3 days off. No hospital, no charts, no noise, just silence and breath. He hiked alone, up a mountain trail he hadn't walked in years, every step a release. At the summit, he sat down. The wind howled. The world stretched below. He whispered to himself, "This is not the end. This is the pause before the next beginning." He closed his eyes, listened, and for the first time in a long while, the silence was kind. Have you ever reached that edge, where quitting feels like peace, but something deeper tells you to hold on just a little longer? James Elwood did, and he chose to stay, not because it was easy, but because his story wasn't finished yet. He didn't need applause. He didn't need clarity. He just needed a single breath of truth to light the path again. And that's the thing about purpose. It doesn't leave you, even when you're ready to leave it. It started with a sound, faint, broken, almost too quiet to notice. A knock, then another. James looked up from his notes. Room 412. A new patient. The chart read Elena Wills, 57, terminal diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 3 months, maybe less. But something about the file felt incomplete. There were no emergency contacts, no family listed, just a note request for isolation, no visitors. He entered gently. The room was dim, curtains drawn, air still. Elena was sitting upright, thin, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. She didn't smile, didn't welcome him, just said, "You must be the new one." James nodded. "Dr. Elwood, just checking in." She tilted her head. You're older than most." He smiled faintly. "So they tell me." She stared a moment, then said, "Good. I'm tired of young ones who pretend to understand." That was the beginning of something quiet and rare. A conversation between two people who didn't need to pretend. Over the next few days, James returned, each visit short, but real. They spoke about books, rain, music, never about cancer. One evening, she asked, "Why did you come back to medicine so late?" He paused, then answered honestly, "Because I realized I wasn't done yet." She nodded. "Me neither." That sentence haunted him, not in fear, but in truth. Because despite her diagnosis, Elena was still alive, still present, still reaching. The next morning, James brought her a book, one he loved as a child, about stars and connection. He left it on her table. No explanation. Later that week, she asked him a question he didn't expect. "If I asked you to do something after I'm gone, would you?" He looked at her carefully and replied, "Yes, if I can." She handed him a letter. "Sealed. Don't read it. Don't open it. Just deliver it. 2 weeks after I'm gone." He took it, held it gently, and nodded. "I promise." 10 days later, Elena passed, peacefully, alone, just as she wished. James attended her final hour, sat beside her, held her hand, and whispered, "You mattered." 2 weeks later, he followed her request. He traveled by train, 3 hours away, to a small town, quiet, unassuming. He found the address, a small bookstore, worn sign, chipped paint. Still standing, he walked in. A man stood behind the counter, late 20s, long hair, tired eyes. James approached. "Are you Daniel?" The man blinked, cautious. "Yes, why?" James handed him the letter. Daniel opened it, read, and froze. Tears filled his eyes. He looked up. She was my mother. James said nothing, just listened. "I haven't seen her in 10 years. We fought. I left. I never called back. I thought she hated me." He held the letter close. "I thought she forgot me." James placed a hand on his shoulder. "She didn't," Daniel cried. Right there, behind the counter. The store quiet, but something loud happened in his chest. Later, as James walked back to the train station, he opened his notebook. He wrote, "One life can leave a letter that repairs another. One patient, one promise that changed 2 lives." Have you ever been asked to carry someone else's final message? To become a bridge between what was lost and what can be found again? James Elwood didn't just heal bodies. He healed stories. He delivered hope even after goodbye. And in that moment, he realized something powerful. Sometimes the greatest medicine is not what you give, but what you carry. Some people leave when it gets too heavy, when the weight becomes too real, but some stay, even when it hurts, even when it breaks them. James Elwood stayed, not because he had to, but because something deep inside refused to let go. It was late autumn now, leaves falling like time. Shifts felt longer, nights colder, but James was still there, present, constant. One evening, he sat alone in the hospital chapel. Empty pews, soft light. He wasn't religious, but something about the stillness gave him space to breathe. He closed his eyes, whispered to the silence, "Why am I still here?" He didn't expect an answer, but sometimes silence answers back. A memory surfaced, clear, unexpected. He was 20. His mother had just passed. He sat in the same silence, asking the same question, and he remembered her voice. Gentle, strong. Stay where the pain is. That's where the healing begins. He opened his eyes, stood slowly, and understood He stayed because healing didn't scare him. Pain didn't scare him. What scared him was not using what he had to help someone else rise. The next morning, he met a new patient, Amir, a 15-year-old refugee, fluent in silence, fluent in trauma. James entered his room. No words, just sat nearby, day after day, without forcing trust, without breaking the silence. Until one afternoon, Amir whispered, "Do you have nightmares too?" James paused, then answered, "Yes, but they don't win anymore." That was the shift. That one moment, Amir began to draw. Scenes from his past, scenes of war, then scenes of hope. James watched, listened, and learned. One day, Amir handed him a sketch. It was James, sitting beside him, silent, steady, present. Underneath, the boy had written, "He didn't fix me. He stayed." James kept that drawing, folded gently in his notebook, right next to the letter from Elena. That night, he wrote, "Sometimes staying is the most powerful form of love." In the weeks that followed, James was asked to speak at a community forum. He almost declined. Public speaking was never his strength, but something told him this time was different. He stood in front of strangers, patients, families, other doctors, and shared what he'd learned. Healing isn't always clinical. It's not always medicine. Sometimes it's presence, a steady hand, a quiet chair beside the bed. Sometimes it's just not leaving. There was silence in the room. Then applause, not loud, but deep. After the talk, a woman approached him, tears in her eyes. She said, "You were my son's doctor last year. I never got to thank you." James smiled. "You just did." On his walk home that night, he looked at the city lights, everything moving, everyone rushing, but he felt still, centered. He had stayed through the burnout, through the doubt, through the exhaustion. And because of that, he had seen things most people miss. Have you ever felt it? That quiet confirmation that you're exactly where you're meant to be, not because it's easy, but because it's right? James Elwood did. And in that knowing, he found peace. He wasn't chasing success or legacy. He was living it. In every life he touched, in every pain he held, in every story he refused to walk away from. Because sometimes the ones who stay are the ones who change everything. Hospitals don't fear death. They expect it, prepare for it, manage it. But some deaths linger. They echo. James had seen many endings, but this one was different. It came slow, soft, unannounced. Mr. Harold Reeves, 79. No family, no visitors. Admitted for respiratory failure, then stayed because no one came. James first met him in room 308. Harold was reading an old newspaper from a week ago. He looked up and said, "I've already outlived my expiration date." James smiled. "That's not a bad thing." Harold chuckled. "Only if you've got someone waiting for you." "I don't." That honesty was sharp, but clean, like he'd made peace with the silence. Over the next few days, James made time for him. Small conversations, simple check-ins. He brought him a fresh newspaper. Harold nodded. "You remember small things. That's rare." One morning, James entered the room. Harold looked tired, different. His hands trembled. His voice faded. He said, "It's close, DOC. I feel it, and I'm not afraid." James sat beside him. No chart, no stethoscope, just presence. Harold turned to him, eyes glassy but aware. "Would you stay? Just until—" James didn't hesitate. "I will." Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The monitor beeped softly. Breathing slowed, then steadied, then stopped. No alarms, no panic, Just stillness. James closed Harold's eyes, took his hand gently, and whispered, "You mattered." Later that evening, he stayed late. Not for work, not for protocol. He just needed to walk the halls a little longer. He paused at room 308. Empty now. Fresh sheets. New beginning for someone else. But to him, a sacred space. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Death is not always the end. Sometimes it's the final place where presence means the most." That night, James went home heavier, not from sadness, but from the weight of having witnessed something pure. Have you ever watched a life fade quietly, not in chaos, but in peace? James Elwood had, and it marked him deeply. The next morning, a nurse found an envelope on her station. No name, just for the doctor who stayed. Inside a drawing, Harold and James, side by side. Signed, "You made my last breath matter." James folded the drawing, placed it next to Amir's, next to Elena's letter. The collection was growing, not of things but of souls. That week, he didn't speak much, not from grief, but from reverence. The kind that makes you walk softer, listen deeper, feel longer. He began to look at every patient differently, not as a case, but as a chapter. A final one, sometimes, but always worth reading. He visited a colleague, Dr. Morales, an oncologist. Brilliant, efficient, but tired. James asked, "Do you ever get used to it?" Morales replied, "No, you just learn not to flinch." James didn't want that. He didn't want to stop feeling, even if it hurt, even if it broke him sometimes, because pain was proof he still cared. One day, a new nurse shadowed James. Young, nervous, curious. She asked, "How do you do this every day without falling apart?" James looked at her and said, "Who says I don't fall apart? I just learned how to keep going while holding the pieces." That answer stayed with her and many others. James wasn't just a doctor. He was becoming something else. A keeper of endings, a witness to worth. That weekend, he visited his mother's grave. First time in years, no flowers, no speeches, just quiet. He sat down on the grass, took out his notebook, and wrote, "You were right, Mom. Healing doesn't always mean fixing. Sometimes it means simply staying, even through the final breath." As the sun set, he felt something shift, not grief, not regret, but peace. He stood up, looked at the sky, and whispered, "I'm still here, and I'm not done yet," because some endings are really just beginnings disguised as silence. James Elwood knew now. He didn't just witness lives. He honored them. Hospitals have rooms you don't find on maps, not on blueprints, not in guides, but they exist, and they carry echoes. James Elwood had heard whispers. A place on the 4th floor, past the recovery wing. It wasn't labeled. No one assigned patients there. They called it the legacy room. One evening, his shift ending late, James took the long hallway. Lights dimmed, floor quiet, and there it was. A room with no number, door slightly open. He stepped in. No monitors, no beeping, no smell of antiseptic. Just shelves, walls lined with objects, and silence so thick you could hear thought. In the center, a journal, leather bound, worn. He opened it. Handwritten entries, all by staff, all about patients, not symptoms, not diagnosis, but memories. She used to hum while we changed her for. He gave me a bracelet from his village in Peru. She waited every morning for her daughter, even when she never came. James stood frozen. This room wasn't about death. It was about what stayed behind. He took out his own notebook, the one he never left without. Elena's letter, Amir's drawing, Harold's sketch. He He ran his fingers over the pages, each story alive. Then he sat at a small desk in the corner and began to write, not for a chart, not for a file, but for remembrance. Mr. Harold Reeves didn't die alone. He died seeing. He died heard. Amir taught me how silence can speak, and how art remembers what pain forgets. Alana trusted me with her final message, and in doing so, gave me a new beginning. He left the page unsigned, but folded it, tucked it in the journal. On the way out, he noticed a quote carved into the doorframe, barely visible. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's who remembers you when you're no longer here. That night, he couldn't sleep, not from worry, but from a sense of purpose. The next day, he shared the room with a young intern. Her name was Lisa, new, eager, still unsure if she belonged. He brought her there without saying why, just opened the door. She stepped in and gasped softly. "What is this?" James replied, "A room that teaches us what medicine often forgets, that memory is its own kind of healing." Lisa read silently, then turned to him and said, "Can I write something too?" He nodded. "You must." Weeks passed. More entries. More names, more stories. The room filled not with noise, but with legacy. One evening, James found a note taped gently to the journal. "You saved my father's dignity. We never said goodbye, but he told me about the doctor who listened. Thank you." No signature, no return address. Just proof that impact doesn't always knock. Sometimes it leaves a whisper. James added another entry that night. "Sometimes you don't save a life. You save a name, a memory, a truth that shouldn't be forgotten." Have you ever wondered what you'll leave behind when your title fades, your voice goes quiet, and your hands no longer hold? James Elwood didn't wonder anymore. He knew. He wasn't chasing a plaque, not an award. He was building a room, one entry at a time, one soul at a time. Legacy wasn't about being remembered by all. It was about being remembered truly by a few. As the hospital changed around him, new staff, new policies, the legacy room remained untouched, protected, preserved. He left the key in the same place every time, inside the third book on the shelf, the one about stars. Because he believed, even after people disappear, their light lingers. Like stars we can't touch, but still guide our path. And if you've ever felt that a presence long after a goodbye, a lesson that lives inside you, then maybe you've been to your own legacy room too. Hospitals don't hold on to names. They move fast. Records are archived. Rooms are reassigned. But some names don't fade. James Elwood's badge still hung by the time clock. Same photo, same faded ID number. But people didn't say, "That's Dr. Elwood." They said, "That's the man who stayed." It had been 10 years since he returned. 10 years of quiet presence, of holding hands, of writing legacies. 10 years of choosing people over procedure. One Monday morning, James didn't show up. No call, no note, no sign. Just silence. A nurse checked his apartment. Lights off, everything in place. His notebook lay open on the table. A single sentence written, "When it's time, I'll know." No one knew where he'd gone, but no one panicked. Somehow, it felt right. In the days that followed, stories surfaced. From patients, from janitors, from families who never met him, but felt him. Lisa, now a resident, opened the legacy room and found a new envelope. Inside, dozens of folded pages, each one titled "A Moment I Didn't Want to Forget." Moments like the boy who whispered, "I trust you." The woman who asked if I believed in angels. The silence that made me cry in room 412. James had written them all, not for recognition, but to remember. That week, staff took turns reading aloud. Each night, one story. Soft voices in the quiet room. No ceremony, just presence. Eventually, a small plaque was placed on the door. The Elwood Room for every life that mattered. Visitors began to stop by, not to grieve, but to reflect. They'd read the journal, leave their own entries. Some drew, some wrote prayers, some just sat. James had never chased a legacy, but he built one by refusing to look away. Years later, a young doctor paused outside the room. He asked Lisa, "Who was Dr. Elwood?" She smiled, took a breath, then answered, "He wasn't just a doctor. He was proof that one person's presence can echo through hundreds of lives." Some said he went abroad. Others believed he went off-grid. A few whispered he found a small cabin in the mountains and still writes in that same notebook. No one knows for sure. And maybe that's the point, because James Elwood didn't need a final chapter. His story keeps unfolding in every act of stillness, every hand held, every life remembered. Have you ever felt like someone stayed with you long after they were gone? That's who he became. A quiet echo, a lasting breath. And maybe, just maybe, that's all any of us hope for. Not to be known by many, but to matter deeply to a few. So when the video fades and you go back to your day, remember this. One quiet person, one honest presence, one human soul can change everything. And if you believe that if you felt something watching this, maybe you're ready to carry that light forward. Because James Elwood was never just a doctor. He was a reminder that being fully present is the most powerful legacy of all. If this story touched you, take a breath, close your eyes, and think of someone who stayed when they didn't have to. Then be that person for someone else. And if you'd like to keep hearing stories that remind you what truly matters, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay with us for what really matters.